Hi everybody. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for this incredible day that you've set up. So delighted and honored to be a part of it. I really like the concept of thought-provoking and creating discussion. And so this is really for me a real opportunity um, as I am a law professor and I have a lot of very young JDs in some of my classes who are very timid about speaking. I really like the opportunity because one of the amazing things about space law is that it's constantly evolving, and I keep trying to remind everybody that the your voice not only can be heard but should be heard. And so hopefully today I will inspire you, to think about how we look at the future in a very different way, and also inspire you to have your voice heard. So I am Michelle Hanlon. I am the co-director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. We are the oldest space law center in the entire world. We were teaching space law before any other law school. And that's because our forefather, Stephen Garov, came to us from Yale in 1967. So he started it. We also are home to the Journal of Space Law, which is the only journal in the world dedicated to space law. Right now, there are four space law centers in the world, two in the United States, in Mississippi and Nebraska, one in Colorado, one in Canada, Colorado wishful thinking, right? In Montreal, and one in the Netherlands. So it's a growing field, this concept of space law. And what's really exciting about space law, what really people have to realize about space law, is that it is going to be a part of everyday life within the next decade, easily. Everything we do already is impacted by things in space. We get a lot of our information from space, and that sort of symbiotic, it's not a symbiotic relationship, that relationship, that requirement, that need for space is just going to grow and grow and grow. I'm also the co-founder of an organization called For All Moonkind. We are the only organization in the world that's focused on protecting human heritage in outer space. So think about Apollo 11, but also think about Luna 2, the very first human-made object to impact another celestial body, or Chang'e 4, the very first human-made object to actually explore the far side of the moon. For All Moonkind is a permanent observer to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. I go to Vienna for 6 weeks each year to participate in the making of space law. And when I say that, observers are not given the same voice as countries, but we are given the opportunity to observe, and we are given the opportunity to make statements. And so, as you'll see, as I get to the end of my presentation, it's again a real opportunity to be heard about space law. This is a very, it's a growing area, but one that really needs voices because we're still developing it. And I just see Rebecca reminding everybody, yes, think about questions to ask me, but I want to plant in your head a question. How do you think we ought to own property on the moon? How do you think we should, what do you think we should do with the moon? Should we protect it? If people want to mine it, should we let them? If we do partition the moon, how should we do that? How do we ensure that whatever we're doing in space on the moon is something that is equitable and inclusive of everybody? Because bottom line, even under space law, even under our international treaties, space is for everyone. I'm also the president of the National Space Society, and apologies, part of the reason I was a little late this morning was because we are having our board meeting. But the National Space Society is the preeminent civil organization in the world focused on moving human communities into space. This is our entire remit, our entire reason for being. We want to see communities in space, and so we have people involved in technology, policy, human physique, and psychology. Like, how are we going to do this successfully? I encourage you to check us out and join if you can. So it is without question that the decisions we make today with respect to the legal model for activities in the exploration and exploitation and utilization of space resources will have far-reaching implications for the future. So I'm focused on this concept of, I hate the word exploitation, on the use of space resources, because fundamentally, if if we're going to go to space successfully, we can't take everything on Earth with us, right? It's way too expensive even to bring our own water for a long stay. So we need to be able to use the resources of space to sustain ourselves in space. Even if we are talking about just sending robots, like we don't want to send humans to space, those robots are going to need to build habitats for themselves to protect themselves from very long, dark nights and from radiation. And so we need to use space resources. Now, the first question, even as we're thinking today, do we belong in space? That's another question I want you to think about. A lot of my students ask me, we have done such a terrible job on Earth. Why should we go to space? Why do we even need to think about going to space? Why should we be allowed or spend the money to figure out how to use the resources of space? And hopefully I will help answer those questions today. So the history of humanity on the moon, and I focus on the moon because it's our closest neighbor. It's where everyone has their sight sets for the next 5 or 10 years. There are 300 missions planned for the moon before 2030. And that's an incredible amount when you think how we are going back. And these missions to the moon are going to be looking for ways to mine, looking to figure out what resources are there, looking to see how humans can exist in low gravity, looking to see how we can protect humans from radiation. Again, it's a great question to ask, what is the rationale for that expense? But I focus on the moon for those reasons. So human history on the moon begins with this object, Luna 2. The Soviet Union hard landed the first ever human-made object on another celestial body in 1959, a full decade before Apollo 11. And being humans, we don't just land stuff, we have to say we're here. I was at a TED Talk about Pompeii, and even in way back when in Pompeii, if you look at the walls that have survived, there's graffiti on them, and the graffiti is like basically John was here. So humans have this need to remind people that we're here, and so the Soviet Union is no different. They have this ball, it's medallions with the USSR and Cyrillic and the year, and this was intended to sort of explode over the surface of the moon when this landed. They will not say it was a claim to anything, but the sad news is that it pretty much it crash landed, so we're pretty sure everything vaporized in the impact. But this is the first object ever to impact another celestial body. More than 20 Luna missions followed that. What you see there, the vertical picture is Luna 9, the first human-made object ever to succeed in a soft landing on another celestial body. The Luna 9 landed on the moon. And then over there you see Lunokhod 1, which are the first wheels on another celestial body. The Apollo rovers were not the first wheels. They were the first human-driven wheels, but not the first wheels. Of course, Apollo is the most well recognized of the moon missions, and we see these Neil Buzz Aldrin about to put the second footsteps on the moon. But when we went to the moon on Apollo 11, it wasn't just about putting humans on the moon. There was a lot of things going on with respect to that. Obviously, it was in the middle of a Cold War. Obviously, we were in a competition. But what did the Apollo astronauts take with them? They took a gold olive branch, a sign of peace. They took this disc the size of a $50 with messages of peace from 74 nations. Every single one of those messages talks about, wow, what an amazing human accomplishment. We hope that this builds kinship amongst us on Earth. We hope that being finally able to do this will let us put our squabbles to rest. Let us use this as a moment of kinship. So, we were in a Cold War, so there's no message of peace from Russia, but 73 nations other than the United States all expressed these thoughts, even President Tito from then Yugoslavia. So, we're really looking at this effort to get humanity to embrace. And certainly, if you look at the sort of the prorated numbers, more humans alive watched Apollo 11 than any other event simultaneously in history. This was a unifying human event. But even more than that, when Neil and Buzz went, they also had the opportunity. They were told, you can bring something that you want. And they brought the patch from Apollo 1 to honor the astronauts who perished in the fire in Apollo 1, and from the fire from which we learned a lot. But they also brought the medallions from the Russian cosmonauts, the Soviet cosmonauts who had passed away in this human effort to reach the stars. Apollo 11 is fundamentally a human achievement. It is certainly, it's an American achievement, and we have to recognize the 400,000 Americans who were involved in that process. And we have to recognize that it was American taxpayers who paid it for it, right? But it was a human achievement. It was a small step for humankind, not just for humankind, not just on behalf of humankind, but because of humankind. So Apollo 11 was followed by, I'd like to put everybody in the mood by telling you what's up there right now. So Apollo 12, there's a rumor that there is this little ceramic tile that is affixed to the lunar module. And this tile has sketches by the foremost artists of the time, including Andy Warhol. So rumor has it that this is affixed to the leg of the LEM, and that this would be the first art museum, the first artwork on the moon. Now, of course, at the time, it was against every NASA policy whatsoever for anybody to affix something on the LEM or any part of the Apollo mission surreptitiously. So nobody has admitted to doing this, and nobody has admitted that it's there. There's a whole PBS special about, is it there, is it not, and they go deep down. But this is one of the things, if it's there, that's an artifact that we want to protect. If it's not, what a wonderful urban legend. Apollo 14, well, of course, we know Apollo 13 did not make it to the moon. Apollo 14, we have the first golf balls shanked on the moon. So there are a lot of other firsts related to Apollo 14, but I really want to get you in thinking about the culture that we brought with us. So when the Apollo astronauts went, they did all their scientific research, but they also expressed themselves as humans. Apollo 15, we have the first human-driven wheels on the moon, and we have the feather and hammer test. Now, I don't know about you guys. I'm a lawyer, and so I took physics and I kind of understood it. But it really, for me, watching that video, you drop a hammer and the feather from the same height in a vacuum, they land at the same time. I was like, oh. Okay, I kind of get. I don't really get it, but now I see it. So, but that feather and that hammer still on the moon. Also, with Apollo 15, they left behind what we call the fallen astronaut memorial. And that's the name of all of the astronauts, not just American, all of the astronauts and cosmonauts who have perished up until then in the human effort to reach the moon and the stars. And that's a little astronaut there. This is still on the moon, pristine. Apollo 16, again, a lot of firsts, but I like to remind people about the human parts of it. And Charlie Duke left a picture of his family on the moon. Probably all faded now. If some aliens come and pick it up, it's just going to be white. They're not going to have any idea what us humans look like. But still, that need to be, humans were here. That Apollo 17 was our last mission, first scientist on the moon with geologist Harrison Schmitt. But this is coming up on our 50th anniversary. It's been 50 years since a human has set foot on the moon. In addition to the human missions, there's a lot of robotic missions. There are more than 110 sites on the moon that have evidence of human activity. And that's everything from the U-22 rover on the to the Ranger missions, and everything in between. Ranger, of course, this particular model carried the part of the remains of Eugene Shoemaker to the moon. And so those are the first human remains on the moon that we know of anyway. Surveyor 3 is a special robot. Apollo 12 landed about 300 feet from Surveyor 3 and brought a piece of Surveyor 3 back to Earth so we could see firsthand, or scientists and geologists could see firsthand what happened to things on the moon over time. And so this is really our first archaeological dig on the moon. These images were taken from the Lunar Reconnaissance orbiter, and I put them up to show you everything is still there. You can actually still see the boot prints on the moon. You can see the rover tracks. You can see the descent stages. All of these things, all of these human artifacts are preserved on the moon because of the vacuum, because there's no weather, and honestly, because it's hard to get to. So whereas on Earth we have catch people all the time chipping off pieces of the pyramids or picking up pieces of the Great Wall of China, that's not happening on the moon yet. So those sites memorialize the work of tens of thousands of Americans, people like Ron Creel, who helped develop the lunar achievement, but it's a milestone and a crowning achievement. So think about the milestones of human history. When discovered how to harness and control fire instead of being afraid of it. When humans understood, they overcame their primal fear of open water and built boats. When humans started to communicate with each other through drawings, these are human milestones. But more than that, we don't get to the moon unless some human has done each of these things, right? So the achievement, that blueprint on the moon, is actually the culmination of centuries, eons of human existence. So we don't get to the moon until somebody in the Congo picks up a baboon bone, thigh bone, femur bone, and starts putting hash marks on it. And we believe this is one of the first evidences of humans using math. We don't get to the moon without somebody in Mesopotamia probably picking up sand and thinking, oh, if I heat this up, I can make something translucent like glass. We don't get to the moon without math or glass or astronomers dreaming throughout history, astrologers, engineers, physicists. We don't get to the moon without that constant reminder throughout our evolution of our neighbor moon. These are footprints in Tanzania, Laetoli, Tanzania. We believe these are the first evidence of when humans stood upright. These were discovered in 1972. These are 3 million years old. We don't get to the moon unless our common ancestor in Laetoli, Tanzania, for some reason decides to stand up on 2 feet, right? Because then we freed up our hands to carry things, to make tools, to start communicating, to move faster. So we don't get to the moon unless somebody does that. And what's amazing is it took us 3 million years to find those. And we don't want that same experience to happen with our boot prints on the moon. So when I talk about preservation, this is an idea that we welcome and understand well on Earth. It started essentially as a global concept in Egypt, also in 1969, around the same time as Apollo. Egypt understood that in order to develop its economy, it would have to harness the Nile River because that kept flooding their agriculture and they just couldn't develop. So in order to put a dam, the Aswan High Dam, across the Nile River, they knew that they were going to flood the Nubia Valley. The Nubia Valley is considered one of the cradles of human civilization. And so Egypt didn't just say, okay, well, let's just go for it, who cares? They went to the international community and said, hey, we really need to build this dam, but we know that we are going to harm these artifacts which belong to all of humanity. And the international community responded. And they didn't say, oh, who cares, Egypt? They didn't say, you can't do that, Egypt. They said, okay, we will help you. So the 40 nations came together, raised $80 million, I don't know what that is in today dollars, and moved those temples out of the path of the floodplain piece by piece. So that moment, the international community came together and understood and actually sort of demonstrated this belief that preservation is a compelling idea that can help unite people rather than divide them. It is an idea that can help build a sense of community among people throughout the world, and today, people throughout the universe. So when I think about going to space, I liken it, the closest thing that we can liken it to is the Polynesian culture, right? So think about those islands in the South Seas. On many of those islands, if you look out, you cannot see anything on the horizon. All you see is water. You don't see islands, you don't see anything in the distance. And yet, the Polynesians said, you know what, we're going to build boats and go see what's on the horizon, what's over that lip, whatever it is. There was no fear that the world was flat. That was just, we're going to go check it out and we're going to explore. That's where we are today. We have no idea what's out there in space, but we need to build our boats and get there. And what did the Polynesians do? If you travel among the South Seas Islands, you see that they didn't just build boats and go. They took their culture with them. And that's really, really important because that's their sense of humanity, that's their sense of unity, and that's what we need to take with us into space as well. Not just the culture, the knowledge. They took with them from island to island how to grow things. And that, again, part of understanding, part of needing to protect cultural heritage is needing to preserve our experiences and our knowledge. I look at this boat, which is a mock-up of what the Polynesians built, as far as we can tell. And think about the first Europeans going to Polynesia, and they actually did not believe that the Polynesians, they felt that they were too primitive to be able to build boats like this. But imagine if we had had a different idea back then, right? If the Westerners had said, oh, wow, look, we have a lot to learn from them. But they didn't. They said, oh, no, there's no way you could do that. And it took us a long time to understand that they could and to understand how they read the stars as well. So that is one thing that our communities, our cultures throughout history, some more than others, but every culture has been very insular in that this is how we do it. We don't trust the way you do it. And that is, moving on, that is what we need to remember is we need to embrace, and this is when we talk about inclusion and equity in space, it's not about being kind and to other countries. It's not about like, oh, we're all into this together and let's be kind to each other. It's about using the resources and the contributions. We don't succeed without the contributions from our entire diversity of culture. And so this is what I see when I look to space. I think about, when Christopher Columbus went to Isabella and Ferdinand and said, can you give me the money to build this boat to go find a new path to India? Now let's forget about all of the horrible things that happened as a result. And let's just think about the moment. At that moment in time, there was nobody on Earth who believed that whatever Christopher Columbus did would lead to what happened in North America, all the bad, all the good, and ultimately lead to the creation of the greatest democracy on Earth. Now, again, this is not saying that we haven't had our bumps, and a lot of them, but what I'm saying is we have no idea. People say, well, why should we go to space? We have no idea what space has to offer us. None whatsoever. Anybody who tells you, well, I think, no, we cannot possibly have any idea because we haven't been there yet. We haven't done that. So I'm a lawyer. I'm going to talk about my passion for protecting cultural heritage and why we need to have sort of this concept of due regard. I'm going to take you really quickly through the law. We do have an outer space treaty. It was negotiated in the 1960s, ratified in 1967. It spawned three other treaties: the Liability Convention, the Registration Convention, and the Rescue and Return Agreement. They all sort of have the same concepts, but the outer space treaty is really our Magna Carta of space. It says it is our framework, it is our guideline, it is our structure, and that is what we have taken with us. And kudos to, yes, the white men who negotiated the Outer Space Treaty, because they managed to create a document that said space is free for all and that we are going to keep the peace in space. And so far it's worked. So the Outer Space Treaty, again, the exploration and use of space shall be the province of all humankind. Space is for everyone. It's not subject, you can't claim territory in space. The Article 3 says international law applies in space. What I want you to take away from this is Article 1 is fundamentally the statement that space is for everyone. You can do anything you want in space. The Outer Space Treaty says that. The Outer Space Treaty only puts very limited limits on that. It says in Article 3, well, international law is going to apply. It says in Article 4 that You can't put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in space. And then it says in Article 6 that, you're going to be liable if you damage somebody else in space. But that's it. Those are the only restrictions we have on any space activities. So how is that going to help us? So the only other restriction we have is Article 9. It's called the due regard provision. And it says we will have due regard. Any activities in space that you conduct in space must be conducted with due regard for the activities of others. And so I look at that and you think, okay, that means consideration. Non-lawyers are like, yeah, okay, I get that. This is what lawyers think due regard means. This was an arbitration with the Permanent Court of Arbitration. And this was a discussion of due regard, not under the Outer Space Treaty, but under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. And the tribunal decided that, no, we're not going to create a universal code of conduct. Due regard is a balancing test. We're going to look at all of the rights involved, which rights were impaired, how that could have been avoided, so forth and so on. I call this the cha-ching provision for lawyers, because what can lawyers do? They can bicker for a long time, right? And we will keep extending, and we will keep appealing, and we will keep arguing about whose rights were more impinged and so forth. So this is our generation's responsibility. Figure out what due regard means in space, because I can tell you right now, I don't know what it means to have due regard for our history in space. If we look at the letter of the law, it says if you damage somebody else's object in space, then you're liable for that damage. So what happens if somebody goes to the LEM, to Tranquility Base, if somebody goes to Chang'e 4, somebody goes to Luna 9, and just Chang'e 4 is a bad example because it's still operational, but and just takes the wheel off and says, oh, or takes the ladder off and says, this is cool, I want to keep it. Okay, well, what's the liability there? Those are not operational objects, right? You can't say, oh, you owe me, the $40 million in lost profits that I'm going to have because you took my ladder away. I mean, in many ways, it's irreplaceable, priceless, but that's not something you can litigate in court. And so our history is really at the whim of this concept of due regard. And so this footprint in Laetoli, Tanzania is heavily guarded. It is covered by the tundra of Tanzania because it's been established that that's the best way to preserve them. And we only uncover those at the behest of researchers who have written full proposals as to why they need to do it and what they're going to do and what they're going to see. We are lovingly taking care of this footprint, which we don't even know. We have no idea who exactly it is, why they stood up. We just know 3 million years ago, it shows that humans stood up. And yet we have this boot print. We know exactly what happened. We know the history of that boot print. We know exactly where it is, but it's unprotected. Anybody can right now just go up there, wipe it out without any consideration, without any implications whatsoever. So, when we talk about mining on the moon, everyone says we are ages away from mining on the moon. Even like when I say there are 300 missions going to the moon by 2030, it's a lot of missions, and there are 300 planned by 2030. That's still, the moon is pretty big, right? And people think, well, we don't have to worry about mining operations because it's not going to happen for a while. But our most valuable resource in space is our history in space. And we have to figure out the concept of due regard, because we need to protect that history. For All Moonkind has been successful in making baby steps. And this is what we do, is we're trying to create a movement to get a convention. We have two sort of ideas. One is, okay, we can just borrow from the UNESCO World Heritage Convention, which cannot apply to space, because under the World Heritage Convention, you can only nominate a territory, a site that's within your territory. And Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty says no nation can claim territory in space. So when we first formed, I went to UNESCO and knocked on the door and said, hey, we should change the remit. We have history in space. We have cultural artifacts in space. And UNESCO said, yeah, that's really, we have enough trouble on Earth when we have sites that are in contested territory. And we have enough trouble on Earth trying to figure out how to protect artifacts in the high seas, which belong to, which is territory that belongs to nobody. So tell you what, you go figure that out for All Moonkind. And then when you figure it out, we will borrow your concepts and apply them to the high seas. So we really are in uncharted territory. So what we were able to get the passed the One Small Step Act in 2020. We have now a rule that says, unfortunately, it's a US act. It's the first national act to recognize we have heritage in space. But it says, if you are doing work with NASA, then you will work within NASA guidelines to protect US sites. So it's a baby step, but hardly where we want to be. The Artemis Accords, which were signed, which were introduced also in 2020, and are now signed by 22 signatories, if you count the Isle of Man, have in Section 9 the concept of protecting heritage. So now we have 22 nations that agree, oh, there is history in space. There is something worth protecting. But if you look at that language, and the Artemis Accords are not a binding treaty, they are also principles and guidelines. And you look at that language, it's like, okay, we recognize that this stuff has to be protected, but doesn't say how it's going to be protected. NASA followed that up just a couple weeks ago with the Lunar Landing and Operations Policy Analysis. Again, that policy talks a lot about heritage protection. We're really excited by that. And it talks about finally making the State Department start to think about how we are going to develop a treaty to recognize and protect. So again, I say, is without question that the decisions we make today have far-reaching implications for the future generations and for all of humanity. When we think about due regard, when we think about what it means to have due regard for each other in space, why don't we approach the concept of due regard from the concept of kinship? So we talk about needing safety zones around operational things, and those safety zones are exclusion zones. We want to exclude everybody from, let's just call it what it is, it's property, but we're not calling it property because we're not allowed to under the Outer Space Treaty. But what if we looked at the concept of heritage zones, we step back and say, no, the first heritage zones won't be about exclusion, they will be about inclusion. We will all agree that we will protect certain sites on the moon. And so the first safety zones will be about preservation, conservation, inclusion, universality, and not about exclusion and exploitation. So we are like dwarves, of course. Everyone knows the Bernardo Schatzle. But what I want to be very, very clear about is when I say the shoulders of giants, I'm not talking about the Apollo astronauts. I'm talking about all the people throughout our human evolution who have dreamed about the stars, who have continued that human experience of wanting to reach out and explore space. We are. Frank White actually. Said this first to me. Sorry, it's the first time I heard it was from Frank White, and it really resonates with me. Outer space is such an awful, awful term because space is not out there. We are in space. Earth isn't here and space over here. We are smack dab in space. And so I look at our orbit and beyond as our backyard. We are sitting on the shoulders of an entire human evolution that has dreamed about going to space. And when you ask, should we be going to space ethically? You know what? Yes, we owe it to the cultures, to the people who penned their names, who scraped their names into the walls of Pompeii. I was here, John was here, who left their photos on the moon. Charlie Duke was here. We need to recognize that we need to protect our heritage. And the only way we protect and preserve and honor our history, the history that got us to the moon in the first place, is to continue that history beyond our moon and into space. And so with that, I hope I have generated enough discussion, enough question for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle. What an amazing presentation and good stuff too. And as a space law geek, space law nerd, I was very happy to see all the references to the laws that you put in. So thank you for that. We do have our first question, and it's from AC. And AC says, with ASAT capabilities demonstrated now by at least 3 spacefaring nations and the willingness of one of these for military adventurism, just how long do you think that the OST will hold once international hostilities break out? The OST being the Outer Space Treaty for everyone.
So AC, it's actually 4 nations have demonstrated ASAT capabilities, right? China, Russia, the United States, and India. And they are terrible. The Chinese ASAT test, and it's not just military adventurism. These ASAT tests create debris fields, and those debris fields are very, very dangerous. And for example, when the Russians demonstrated their ASAT capabilities last year, at this time, pretty much, they created a debris field that the International Space Station actually had to move to avoid. And it was so dangerous for our astronauts, cosmonauts and astronauts, that they had to go into the lifeboats in case something happened. So it's not just about military. I'm big, and I mean, yeah, it's a lot about, let's be honest, this sandbox on Earth is getting a little small for our playground bullies, right? How will the OST stand up? How will the Outer Space Treaties stand up in the face of this kind of aggression? It's getting really massively tested right now, AC, and you're totally right. The Putin, a couple weeks ago, or I guess it's a month ago now, suggested that because Starlink was providing services to the Ukraine, Russia considered Starlink to be a legitimate target. And what would happen if the Russians blew a Starlink satellite out of orbit, right? Or demolished it, and you would create debris. You would create a situation where we know international law applies to space, and so we would have to go to the UN Charter. Should the U.S. respond as an act of self-defense? Starlink is a U.S. object under the law, so that would be Russia attacking a U.S. object. These are really hard questions. I think one thing that we have working in our favor is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space at the United Nations. This is one of the, I think, I'm not a fan of the United Nations. I think it means well, but it just, there's too much corruption. But the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space has endured and has kept the peace in space. And when you go to the COPUOS meetings, people are really friendly. Well, not so much now. It's a little tough to be friendly to Russia. But this is a place where people go and talk about space. And when we negotiated, when the Outer Space Treaty was negotiated, we were in the middle of a Cold War. And so we have to hope that those sensibilities will also endure as well. And I just want to make one other point. And Nicola, thank you so much. I love being called cool, but I'm such a nerd. Anyway, the idea that, of the militarization of space and how we use space. The very first use of space was for military purposes. I mean, the only reason President Eisenhower did not object to Sputnik flying over was because he wanted to be able to fly satellites over the Soviet Union so that we could see what was going on. So the very first uses of space were military. And to be very clear, the Outer Space Treaty says in its preamble that space shall be used for peaceful purposes. It doesn't say that in any operational provision. Article 4 says the moon and other celestial bodies shall be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. So this is really something we need to think about. And this is, again, I talk about this generation having to figure out what due regard means, and teasing out how that, how we can actually put some ironclad rules of conduct into place under the rubric of due regard, because the concept of the militarization of space, honestly, is just really scary. We also do have the disarmament side of things that works outside of the civil uses of space. So we do have disarmament working in our favor right now. But I do think, honestly, it's pretty easy for us to see when something gets launched. And so we have a pretty good eye on each other. When I say we, I mean China's watching us, we're watching China. It's hard to do things in space without everybody knowing. And hopefully the 1950s as, as funny and archaic, and looking at that group of white men in a room feels like, oh, archaic. They did a good job, and now it's on us to continue that job.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, AC. And who would like to ask the next question? Please raise your hand, speak up. Go ahead, Tasha, we're listening.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me all right here?
Yes.
Cool. Thank you so much for all those fun facts about what's still on the moon. That was really interesting to me. So the Artemis landing sites are quite far from the Apollo landing sites, are my understanding. So when do you think humans or robots are ever going to go back to the Apollo landing sites and maybe also do some scientific objective research for like how exposure to the space environment has like deteriorated it, or for preservation purposes and stuff like that?
So I think that hopefully it will be a very long while before we go back to the Apollo, because we don't know how to approach Apollo without damaging it right now. Unfortunately, it's also a tourist site. So, while the United States can limit the activities of Americans, we have no right to limit the activities of anybody else. And so for a while, a German company called PT Scientists was actually going to go to Apollo 17 and take the camera off the rover and bring it back to Earth as part of the Google Lunar X Prize. That was like their mission. And that's when NASA was like, wait a minute, that's going to ruin everything. But Harrison Schmitt actually, when I introduced For All Moonkind to him, he was the geologist on the moon. He's like, of course, we got to go back and recycle all that material, not preserve it. It costs a lot of money to get stuff up there. So there is going to always be a tension between development and preservation, recycling and preservation. I think, again, I hope it's a long time before we get back to Apollo 11, but I also think that there are going to be opportunists who will say, if I can get to the moon, and we have 300 missions, including a lot of private missions planning on going back, then we can get to, and we can imagine bringing the messages of peace back to Earth and selling them on the market. It's a huge, back in 2019, I don't know if you know this, so when Neil Armstrong, he was the first man, and he had a bag, and he collected the first moon samples into this bag. So it was first man, first bag, first moon samples, right? NASA got that bag, and then they loaned it out as part of a group of stuff to a museum in Kansas City. And so this whole pile of Apollo stuff went to Kansas City. Unfortunately, the curator, the director of the Kansas City Museum, was embezzling funds. And so the Kansas City Museum went completely bankrupt and had to sell off its collection. Unfortunately, that bag ended up in the museum collection, and it did not get returned to NASA, right? But NASA never wrote to Kansas City and said, hey, we didn't get our bag back or anything like that. So that was put up on auction, and a woman bought it for $800. And so then she actually sent it back to NASA and said, is this legit? And NASA said, yes, it's legit. Thank you very much for returning it. And she said, oh, no, it's mine now. I bought it. I spent $800 on it. And it went to court. It was litigated for many, many years. And if you read the court opinion by the judge, you can really hear him crying, because through the chain, through the law and the chain of ownership and possession, NASA lost control of the ownership of that bag. And the judge basically said, NASA, get your shit together, because I can't believe you just lost the first bag. So she sold that bag at auction at Sotheby's in July 2019 for $2.7 million. But it doesn't stop there. Okay, so she pays $800. She gets $2.7 million. And then she sues NASA again, because she said, you kept some of the minuscule pieces of regolith, which reduced the cost of the bag. So I should have gotten 4 million, but because you kept these little tiny pieces of dust, I only got 2.7 million. And sure enough, NASA had to return. There's literally microscope slides, like from high school. Do they even do that in high school anymore? I'm so old. But these little slides with the little speck on it, they had to return them to her, and she sold them for an additional like $1.8 million. So there's a market for this stuff. And if NASA can lose the first bag at a time when we really had only a few missions, 2 missions a year tops, right? imagine there's just no way we can continue to regulate the flow of this stuff as more and more missions go to the moon. And that's why it's so important that, again, anybody who studies law, or who, you don't have to study law to know that public international law is very hard to enforce, right? Russia, bad, don't invade Ukraine. China, bad, don't claim the Spratly Islands. There's not much we can do, but certainly just at least having a framework to give us the opportunity to wave our finger and to name and shame is a lot more than just like, oh yeah, okay, there goes a bag. So I don't know. Realistically, I don't think there will be any official missions planned. I think China's not a member of the Artemis Accords, but they value history. They've shown that. Russian law has a preservation provision in it as well. So unless things get really, really bad here, I think what we have to worry about is a rogue commercial entity doing it just to get the money.
Yeah, thank you, Tasha. Thank you for your question. Michelle, I have a follow-up for what you just said. So if that rogue commercial entity was actually benefiting all of humankind by installing valuable lunar infrastructure on the moon, things that we all need to be able to build our space ecosystem, say they were putting in, I don't know, I'm not a developer, so let's just pretend we needed roads and buildings and launch pads. And they were willing to do that because they were going to highly benefit from it. They wanted to do mining or they wanted to do other stuff, but it was going to cost them an extra $1 billion to go around the sites that you're recommending that we keep as a heritage site. What is the trade-off here? Do we allow the desecration of these heritage sites, or do we cancel the deal and then they back out and they say, well, we can't get the other $1 billion. We're just not going to develop.
So I always use England as an example. Every time England builds a new road, they uncover some king, right? And they're like, oh, geez, everything's got to stop. But they don't stop the development of the road, and they didn't stop the damming of the Nile, the Aswan High Dam. They moved things away. And so there are ways, preservationists, archaeologists, anthropologists will tell you, okay, let's memorialize it. They would rather everything stay in situ. I mean, the archaeologists just went, don't touch the moon, nobody go back until archaeologists get there, so we can see, whether Neil Armstrong really did leave his daughter's locket on the moon or whatever. Where did when Buzz threw out the messages of peace, where exactly did they land? Was it a left shoulder or a right shoulder? So it's important to record these things in situ. But already, like I said, there are 110 sites on the moon with human activity on them. We don't want to protect every single site in situ, right? So I would say, Apollo 11, yes, protect in situ, keep it. But what if somebody comes and says, well, that's where all the water is? It's gonna be a tough decision. But let's have a decision-making process. Let's not just say, oh, go for it. So that's what I'm not an archaeologist or an anthropologist. My job is to build the framework to make everybody stop and think, and then bring in the experts to say, okay, yeah, okay, we can, let us take pictures and then we'll move it. You can go through, or no, we just, sorry, this is something, it's $1 billion to you, but it's priceless to humanity. We want all of humanity always to see that first blueprint, and that just can't be changed.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if you said this in your presentation, but how many other countries currently are supporting your endeavor?
So for All Moonkind, we have about 78 lawyers, and we represent every continent except Antarctica. What we don't have, Romania and Mexico introduced a proposal at the UN that contemplates protecting heritage. And it was Russia's in a very niet mood these days, and it was soundly dismissed. Of course, the United States has recognized heritage in space, and 22 nations have signed the Artemis Accords. So we know that 22 nations understand that there's something to protect. We have not been able to get one nation to actually put forward our proposal. So the way the UN COPUOS works is permanent observers can make statements, but we can't say propose a working group, or we can't propose a resolution. Mexico and Romania that have come the closest to supporting us in that way. Everyone else is worried because nobody has said to us, and we've talked to Russia and Iran and China and Venezuela and Cuba. We've talked to everybody. Nobody has ever said that's a bad idea. Of course, the Russians want us to just bring everything back to Earth, which is kind of an interesting take on it. But nobody says it's a really bad idea to protect. But everybody says 201, it's really hard, and I don't know how you're going to do it and get around Article 2. And so until we get to a point where we can make everybody comfortable with the plan we've done, we won't get that. We are in 2023, we are going to propose to the UN that we should have just a recognition. We should have a General Assembly resolution that just says, hey, there are artifacts in space. Aren't humans amazing? And maybe if they name Apollo 11 and Luna 2 and Chang'e 4, maybe that'll be really helpful. I don't know, but that's our 2023 remit.
Okay, well, best of luck with that. I am wondering if you're bringing in, if you're partnering with people who run VR, virtual reality, to create kind of like a virtual museum or anything up on those heritage sites.
I know that there are people talking about it, and we support them 100%. But we have not had one of the things. This is a self-funded. We are all volunteer. My day job is as a professor of law, and so if we need volunteers to help us continue to do that reach out process. But yeah, I know that there are some really wonderful VR opportunities out there.
Very cool. And I'm going to ask one more question and then we'll open the floor again. There's a company called LifeShip. I'm not sure if you've heard of them, but they're depositing DNA, human seed DNA and plant and animal DNA onto the moon. And, I was wondering if they needed a heritage site so that whatever depository we have on the moon, it doesn't get jumbled. What's protecting that DNA right there in that spot where you leave it on the moon. Have you partnered with something like that at all, or are you considering that?
So I am a firm believer in not using the moon as the world's attic, and I have a fundamental issue with this concept of send a locket of your hair to the moon, because I don't really understand. You can't say that that's going to be there forever in perpetuity. I mean, that's just wrong. And would you go to Yellowstone and leave your DNA by Old Faithful? Like, why is the moon suddenly like, oh, let's just throw stuff up there? It's literally like throwing stuff out of your car, right? But because it's far away and it was expensive to get to, it's okay because I'm rich and I can do that. I have a fundamental issue with that, so I'm sorry if I've offended anybody. But under the law, the United States has to authorize and supervise any missions of its nationals. As far as I know, the United States has not licensed anybody to do that yet. So we don't even know if that's going to be a possibility. And I'm hoping maybe we can create like a patch on the moon, like we have dog walking patches, where everyone just sends their crap there. But if you are suggesting that I'm going to put that there and it's going to stay there in perpetuity, that's just false, because that's claiming property.
Yeah, and a great example of how confusing the laws are right now, because they're limited in what they say. Okay, so AC did throw another question in the chat, and then anyone else who wants to ask a question, please raise your hand or put it in the chat quickly. We are going to take Michelle's final words, and then we'll break for lunch. We'll have a 1-hour break. AC wrote, in the Apollo 12 mission, we landed the Surveyor 3 probe to recover the camera to return to Earth for analysis. What is to keep another nation to do the same for any of the other Apollo landing sites? I think you've already gone over this.
So this is actually a great question, because it allows me to talk a little bit about the plume effect as well. But under Article 8 of the Outer Space Treaty, anything that is sent into space remains under the control and jurisdiction of the nation that sent it. So AC fundamentally, Surveyor 3 is a US object, and another commercial entity would have to get permission from the United States to bring an article back. And we did talk about the first bag, and we know that there's no way for us to enforce that. So no, there's nothing stopping another nation from going to an Apollo site and grabbing something and bringing it back and selling it. One thing I just wanted to point out with respect to the Apollo 12 mission, the Apollo 12 landed 300 feet from Surveyor 3. And when we brought the piece back from Surveyor 3, we saw how pitted it was from the regolith. And so another danger we have on the moon, another thing we have to worry about with respect to due regard, is that we have this thing called the plume effect. When something lands on the moon, you have all of that propulsive force, sort of slowing down the spacecraft, and that jets all of the regolith out. And regolith is not subject to weather. So it's not like walking on a really nice Caribbean beach where the sand is really soft. It's really harsh. And it's about 6 to 18 inches in places. And so that just gets zoomed out, and it actually looked like the Surveyor 3 was sand blasted. And so that, imagine if you land or you drive a rover too close to one of these heritage sites, it could do tremendous damage to the heritage. It will do tremendous damage to operative sites, a mining operation. We saw that with the rovers, that the rovers almost stopped working because they kicked up too much regolith into their instruments. So on top of everything else, and one of the reasons we really have to think about what due regard means with respect to places on the moon in particular, is how far away you have to be to make sure you don't do damage to an artifact or to a mining operation.
Wow, that is so different from here on Earth.
Yes.
And Michelle, how can one become a UN observer if one has a mission or a proposal? How any advice on how to become an observer at the United Nations?
Yeah, it's a process. So you have to be a formal organization, a corporate. For All Moonkind is a 501c3 corporation, because you have to go through the UN. It's called ECOSOC, and I never remember exactly what it stands for, Economic something Social Council. But they will approve you as, okay, yes, we now allow you to participate in the UN. So it's a process, but stick with it. And I will say also, when we went through the process, China objected vociferously to us, because we used a software for our donations page, a dropdown that had in the dropdown Taiwan, not Taiwan province of China. And so we said, okay, so sorry, and we just removed our donations page. But then China said, okay, but now we see that you have on your site a message of peace from Taiwan, and you don't call it Taiwan province of China. And I said, okay, well, China, we are an organization devoted to history, and there is a piece of metal on the moon that says Taiwan. It doesn't say Taiwan province of China, and I will go down on my sword for this one. And thankfully, they backed off. We think because of the invasion of the Ukraine, they had other things to worry about. But we made it, and that was really fraught for 3 years. But you can get temporary status. You reach out to the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs, and they will give you the process, and go on from there. But also, as I said, I'm a member, I'm the president of the National Space Society. So if you have, which is also a permanent observer. So if you have an idea, a concept, a proposal that you would like to be heard on, then reach out to me and we can see if it's something that the NSS or For All Moonkind would back and support for your statement at the UN.
Wonderful. We have a final lightning round question, and then I would like you to give us some final words, Michelle. So the question is, should we use force to create these heritage sites?
So Nick always asks the questions that are just completely unanswerable. Yeah.
Well, he's our ethicist, so of course he does.
Yes. And I did hear a rumor that China has a mission to remove the flags from our sites just because they can. I think that's far down the road. I would like to see protections, and I would like to see safeguards And yeah, I will say, Nick, I will say, if we have gotten to the point where we have recognized, I don't think we can go now. I don't think I don't think we could ask Space Force to shoot down anybody who gets too close to Apollo now, because that's just defending, in the eyes of the law, that's just defending useless property. But if we can get it recognized as a heritage site, a universal heritage site, something special, something that means something to humanity, then we would have the ability to defend it with force.
Wow, okay. Any final words before we take a 1 hour break?
Yeah, first of all, thank you all for listening to me and my little soapbox. I really, to me, the most important message is that space is really for everyone, and what we're really trying to do, and what our focus is, in addition to really protecting heritage, is making sure that every culture and every nation recognizes their contribution to that moon landing. And so we have our fantastic heritage experts who are actually they're creating a chart working back from the boot print. And I just mentioned the baboon bone in the Congo and the sand in Mesopotamia, but they are finding connections to every culture throughout history, which is just really fantastic. And because we are all a part of that boot print, and we should always think about that with every endeavor that we have in space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We appreciate your
Thank you
visit
so
here.
much.
It's always a pleasure.